Greetings, this is Charles Darwin, and I'm here to talk to you about camouflage and mimicry, sometimes deceptive mimicry. Now, this occurs a lot in the natural world. It can be something as simple as insects having camouflage coloration, for instance, mantises looking like leaves so that they can be hard to see. But oftentimes, organisms will imitate other organisms for deceptive purposes. For instance, orchids that look like wasps, thus tricking the wasps into trying to mate with the orchid, which of course does not do anything good for the wasp, but rather allows the wasp to carry the pollen from one orchid to another. Deceptive mimicry. Well, this happens in the human world also, as we are only too aware of, and it happens in the world of scientists as well. Many of us scientists this past year received a packet that looks something like this. And it says, very big on the outside, the New York Times. And so, of course, the first impression you would have receiving this packet is that it's from the New York Times. But if you look closely, you find that the return address doesn't actually say New York Times. It doesn't say anything at all on there. This is just some advertising where they took a quote from the New York Times that had little to do with what was on the inside of the packet. This is actually from an organization that tries to deny the reality of global warming. And they want to create the impression in the people who receive this packet, which not only included scientists but also journalists as well, and others who may have an influence on public opinion, that scientists are sort of equally divided on the issues of global warming, that maybe, a lot of scientists don't accept it, maybe it hasn't been established yet. And when you look inside, you find a book like this. And this book is very neatly printed up, so of course it looks like something that must be supported by a lot of money, and it is. And then you find out who wrote this book. It is written by the NIPCC. Now, the international group of scientists who study global warming is called the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. But this group calls itself the NIPCC, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. So you would think that it's sort of like a group similar to the IPCC, but in reality it's much, much smaller. There are 3 authors on here, and this book was published by one of the organizations that is led by one of the authors. Okay, and so you would get the impression by looking at the sponsors on the back and in the literature that accompanies the book that there are 3 independent think tanks that are supporting this literature. However, it turns out that these are 3 very closely interrelated think tanks. They're sort of duplicates of one another. One of them is led by this author, the other one is led by that author, and the other one is led by this author. And so each one of those 3 organizations can say, our work has been confirmed by the work of the other 2 organizations, thus creating the impression that there are 3 scientific organizations that are supporting the denial of climate change. That's the impression that you would get from looking at the cover and the back of the book. And so sometimes deception is used to try to influence public opinion. I thought this was a particularly interesting example of it. Also, in some of the accompanying literature, they tell you where their income came from for the institute that actually published this book. And it says foundations, 60%, individuals, 19%, corporations, 18%. And so what they're trying to show is that it's not just one group of people that's sponsoring this, but it's widely sponsored by foundations, individuals, and corporations. However, one of the think tanks, not one of the ones represented here, but there's another one called the Cato Institute, that right on the front of its homepage, it admits that it's funded by the Koch brothers, who have gotten a lot of money from oil industry. And so it appears, although these groups do not identify which individuals, which corporations, or which foundations are providing their funding, it could also be from the Koch brothers. So remember, the Koch brothers have a foundation, and they have a corporation, and they are also individuals. So you could have the same 2 men be all 3 of these things, foundations, individuals, and corporations. This is also deceptive as a way of making it look like a very large number of people are supportive, especially in the scientific community, of global warming denialism. But this is just the use of deceptive tactics which are widely used in the animal kingdom and are the product of evolution. They can be the product of natural selection. They can also be the product of cultural evolution, and that's what has happened right here. And I thought that was an interesting example of it, and I hope that you are not falling into the trap of believing some of this without asking careful questions about who is it that's saying this, where is their money coming from, and how many people are there. This is Charles Darwin, telling hope and amen.